The house felt different that morning, almost too quiet. The sunlight slipped through the curtains in soft streaks, painting warm patches across the living room floor. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers tracing the rim of a mug while the sound of my parents rushing around filled the background. They were leaving for the weekend, their voices blending with the sound of bags zipping and shoes shuffling at the front door. They kissed me goodbye without much fuss, told me to behave, and reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone, someone would be around. I nodded, trying to sound casual, though I wasn't sure why my chest felt tight. The car engine hummed to life, and soon the driveway was empty. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was strange, expectant. Then he walked into the kitchen. He wasn't a stranger, not by a long shot. We'd grown up together, seen each other in the most ordinary ways, family dinners, school events, lazy afternoons. But today was different. He gave me a half smile as he pulled open the fridge, mumbling a sleepy morning without looking up. I noticed his hair was still messy from sleep, the way the collar of his shirt sat uneven on his shoulder. My heart gave a little jump I didn't understand. We sat across from each other at the table, talking about nothing important, his latest game score, my upcoming project. But every time our eyes met, there was this strange pause, like the air between us was heavier than it should be. I caught myself studying his face longer than I should have, noticing the faint line of a grin when he was trying to hide it. I told myself it was just because we hadn't hung out in a while, that I was just noticing things I'd ignored before. But when he leaned across the table to grab the sugar, and his arm brushed mine, it was like a spark lit under my skin. I glanced away quickly, pretending to check my phone, but the moment clung to me. He seemed to feel it too. He didn't pull his arm back right away, and when he finally did, there was a small smile on his lips that made my stomach twist. We kept talking, the words drifting in and out of real focus, but something in the background had shifted. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't spoken. But it was there, lingering between the clink of mugs and the hum of the refrigerator, something neither of us wanted to name just yet. The house seemed bigger without the sound of anyone else moving around. By mid-morning, the silence had settled so deep it almost felt like the walls were listening. He wandered into the living room where I was scrolling aimlessly on my phone and asked if I wanted to play something. Cards, a board game, whatever. I shrugged and followed him to the dining table, but neither of us seemed truly focused on the game. We laughed at silly moves, but every now and then our eyes would meet and linger just a second too long. The laughter would fade into these quiet stretches where we both look away, pretending to be distracted by the pieces on the table. At one point, he stood to grab us some sodas from the fridge. When he handed me the can, our fingers brushed, and the contact was so small but so sharp it felt like an electric pulse. He hesitated, just slightly, before letting go. I took a sip too quickly, nearly spilling, trying to hide the way my heartbeat had suddenly quickened. He didn't say anything, but I could feel him watching me as he sat back down. The game went on, but neither of us cared who was winning. We abandoned it halfway through and drifted into separate rooms, as if distance might settle whatever was stirring between us. When lunchtime came, we ended up across from each other again at the kitchen table. There were no phones this time, no distractions, just the sound of forks against plates and the occasional hum of the fridge. Every so often our eyes would lock, and it was like both of us were asking the same silent question but were too afraid to speak it. The air felt thick with something we couldn't explain, and in that quiet tension, I realized the morning hadn't been normal at all. Something had shifted, and neither of us could pretend it hadn't. The afternoon sun spilled through the glass doors, casting long shadows across the backyard. He was already outside when I stepped onto the porch, leaning against the railing with his head tilted back toward the sky. A soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of music from the small radio on the windowsill. I walked over and stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin but not close enough to touch. For a while, we just stood there, both pretending to be absorbed by the swaying branches. He started to speak, his voice low, but stopped halfway through the first sentence. I turned to look at him, waiting, but he shook his head with a half-smile like he'd thought better of it. I could feel my chest tightening, the words I wanted to say pressing against the back of my throat, but fear kept them trapped. He shifted his weight, stepped closer, and suddenly our shoulders brushed. The contact was small, accidental maybe, but it made my breath catch. I glanced at him, and this time his eyes didn't look away. There was something there, nervousness, yes, but also something more. My pulse pounded in my ears, and before I could think I whispered, "Do you feel it too?" The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. His lips parted, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then, softly, he said, "Yeah." My heart felt like it had stopped, and started all at once. Neither of us moved right away, as if stepping out of that moment would break something sacred. We stayed like that, our shoulders touching, our breathing almost in sync, letting the silence speak for us. The sun dipped a little lower, and the air seemed thicker, heavier, but neither of us wanted to move. We drifted back inside as the late afternoon light softened through the curtains, filling the living room with a quiet glow. He dropped onto the couch, and I sat at the other end, my hands resting in my lap as if keeping them still might steady the rush inside my chest. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching, our attention slipping back into the same quiet space we'd been circling all day. After a few minutes he spoke, his voice careful, almost testing the air. "I've been confused lately, about who I am." His eyes stayed on the floor, as though saying it to the carpet would make it safer. I felt something in me loosen, because I knew exactly what he meant. I told him I'd been feeling the same, though my words stumbled and caught, like I was trying to keep them from trembling. He looked at me then, really looked, and there was this flicker in his gaze that made my throat dry. We both laughed a little, awkward and soft, not because anything was funny but because the weight of honesty felt too big to just sit in silence. He leaned forward slightly, like he was about to say something more, but instead his eyes dropped to my lips. My breath faltered. Before I could process it, he moved closer, slow enough for me to stop him, but I didn't. His lips brushed mine in the lightest, most uncertain kiss, just a touch, like testing if the world would fall apart. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. We pulled away almost instantly, but the air between us had changed. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum from the television, but beneath it was something louder, our hearts beating in a rhythm that didn't belong to silence anymore. Evening settled slowly, the dim light in the living room turning gold before it slipped into shadows. We sat on opposite ends of the sofa, pretending to scroll through our phones, though I couldn't focus on a single thing on the screen. Every so often, my eyes would flick to him, and more often than not, I'd catch him looking back. There was a weight to the glances now, a heat that made my palms feel damp. After a long stretch of silence, he shifted, setting his phone aside. His hand moved toward me, slow and deliberate, and for a second I wasn't sure if he'd actually go through with it. But then his fingers brushed against mine, and instead of pulling away, I let him take my hand completely. His grip was gentle but certain, and the warmth of his skin seeped into mine like it had been waiting all day to get there. Neither of us spoke for a moment, and the quiet was so thick I could hear the faint rhythm of my own breathing. "I don't want this to end," he said softly, his voice almost breaking the air between us. I felt my chest tighten, and before I could think, I whispered back, "Then don't let it." His thumb brushed over my knuckles, a small, grounding gesture that made everything else fade away. We sat like that, our fingers interlaced, the unspoken understanding wrapping around us like a thread we couldn't cut. Slowly, he leaned in until our faces were just inches apart. I could feel his breath, warm and uneven, and the closeness was almost unbearable. My heart pounded so hard I was certain he could feel it. But just before our lips could meet again, he stopped, holding my gaze like he was waiting for some invisible signal. We stayed there, suspended in that fragile space between wanting and acting, knowing that once we crossed it, there'd be no going back. The night slipped into the early hours of morning, but neither of us could bring ourselves to sleep. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a sound that felt almost too loud against the stillness. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment from the day, the way his hand had fit perfectly in mine, the way his eyes had lingered like they were holding something fragile. A soft knock broke the quiet, and before I could answer, the door opened just enough for him to step inside. The hallway light spilled over his face, catching the hesitant smile tugging at his lips. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, like he was asking permission without words. I nodded, and he crossed the room slowly, each step feeling heavier with meaning. When he reached me, I sat up, and he pulled me into his arms without hesitation. The warmth of his embrace was grounding, as if it anchored everything that had been floating uncertainly between us. "I'm here, always," he murmured against my ear, and the quiet certainty in his voice made my chest ache. I closed my eyes, holding on to him like I could keep that moment forever. "And I'm here too," I whispered back. We stayed like that, wrapped in a silence that wasn't empty but full of everything we couldn't say out loud. Our foreheads touched, and there was a final, slow kiss, unhurried and certain, before the sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted us back. We stepped apart, exchanging one last look that said more than words could. Moments later, the front door opened and voices filled the house, erasing the stillness. On the surface, everything was back to normal, but deep down we both knew nothing would ever be the same again. Night had draped itself over the house, the quiet so complete it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. He suggested we step outside for some air, and I followed him into the garden where the stars scattered across the sky like tiny sparks. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the distant hum of crickets. We walked slowly along the narrow path, our shoulders brushing every so often, each touch sending a quiet ripple through me. He started talking about fear, about how hard it was to understand himself, about the way people's opinions could slice deep even when you tried to ignore them. His words were steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath them. I admitted my own fears, the ones I never said out loud, the fear of being judged, the fear of losing people I cared about just for being honest about who I was. He stopped walking, turning to face me in the pale light from the porch. For a moment we just looked at each other, and then he stepped closer, his hands finding mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. His eyes searched mine, and before I could think, his lips met mine again. This time it was slower, deeper, without the hesitance from before. My chest ached with the force of it, the way the world seemed to narrow down to just that moment. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard, our hands still locked together. We didn't speak. There was nothing to explain, nothing to name. The air between us was full of unspoken promises, and for the first time all day, I wasn't afraid of what they meant. Morning light crept through the blinds, warm and steady, but the weight in my chest hadn't faded. Downstairs, the clatter of breakfast being made filled the air, my parents moving through the kitchen as if the last 2 days had been nothing more than an ordinary weekend. I took my place at the table, and a moment later he walked in, casual, calm, like we'd both silently agreed to guard what had happened. We didn't speak about it, not there, not with anyone else around, but our eyes met briefly over the edge of a coffee cup, and in that glance was every unspoken word from the night before. The rest of the day unfolded in routine. Questions about how things went while they were gone, laughter at a few small stories, the kind of family noise that makes secrets feel heavier. Later, when we were alone, the quiet between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was something solid, something that belonged only to us. Days turned into weeks, and we found ways to see each other, to send small messages, to pass in the hallway with a brush of the shoulder that meant more than anyone else would notice. We talked about the future in pieces, testing the edges of the idea of being honest about who we were and what we meant to each other. There were moments of fear, what our families might say, what the world outside our small corner might do to us, but there were also moments of stubborn hope. One evening, he told me he didn't want to hide forever, and I realized I didn't either. We sat down together, writing letters to explain everything, each word heavier than the last but necessary. I didn't know how our parents would react, and part of me braced for the worst. But when the moment came, and the truth was finally spoken, the world didn't collapse. It wasn't perfect. There were questions, hesitation, confusion, but there was also the beginning of acceptance. We didn't win over everyone's approval overnight, but we had each other, and that felt like enough to start with. Even now, when I think back to those 2 days, I realize it wasn't just when my parents were away, it was when I stopped running from myself. Love had shown up in a place I never expected, and it had changed everything. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that love can survive fear. Subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me, have you ever found something you didn't know you were searching for?